All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second webinar for the Center of Addiction and Faith. My name is Ed Treat. I'm really glad you're here today. We had 99 of you register, and so we're excited about that. And we'd love to know where you're from. Could you, at the bottom of your page, there's a chat button. You can click on that and say what state you're calling in from. And if you're clergy, let us know that. And if you want to share your first name, that'd be great. We're going to use that chat button later in the webinar for your questions. In fact, throughout the webinar, if you have a question, go ahead and post it. That way you get closer to the front of the line. But post it there, and we will deal with the questions later in the webinar today. But we're really glad you're here. Thank you for taking the time. We're going to be talking about how to start an addiction ministry in your church. And we're going to give you some introduction to that, and we're going to hear from an expert who's the best consultant on how to do this, has been doing this for many years, and we're excited to have him here today. So our guest today is Drew Brooks. You'll see him there on your left, it should be. Drew is the Executive Director of Faith Partners. He's been providing leadership training for congregational addiction team ministry for over 20 years. He's worked in prevention and treatment, public health for over 34 years. He's worked with Hazelden and the Johnson Institute, providing training and consultation to faith communities, schools, and community organizations from across the country. It's a national ministry. He's been doing it a long time, and he does it very well. So thanks for being here today, Drew. And Drew brought with him Carol Pine, and Carol was trained by Drew many years ago, 2004, and she's here today to share some of her experience and how Faith Partners and the ministry, addiction ministry, worked in her church, and what she's been doing since then. So Carol, we're grateful to have you here today. We're going to begin with a word of prayer. So the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. God, we thank you for the opportunity to continue to join together, to learn and grow and do ministry, even in the midst of this terrible pandemic, even in the midst of these racial tensions and all the political unrest in our world. God, we need your help. We ask that you would bring healing to all of it and all of us. Help us as we go through this to minister to those who suffer the most through this time, especially those suffering from addiction, the disease of despair. So make us, God, your church, and make us better able to reach and serve those who need it most. We ask in Jesus' name, amen. And so now I want to turn it over to Tim King, my co-host. He is the author of a fantastic book called Addiction Nation. I recommend it to you. It's a great book for any faith community that's preparing or thinking about doing this ministry or is doing the ministry. Tim makes an incredible case for how addiction impacts every one of us. A lot of times we think, oh, addicts, that's for the people that have it really bad, the opioids and the heroin addicts and the drunks. Tim makes a case that we're all impacted by this personally and as a culture, and makes a great case for that. So it's a fantastic book for preparing you for this ministry and for opening your eyes to seeing it in a whole new way. So thanks, Tim, for being here, for introducing us to the topic, and I'll pass it over to you, Tim, please.
Thanks, Ed. And part of my role too is I am now a board member for the Center of Addiction and Faith, and exciting to be a part of that growing ministry. And as Ed said, part of why I wrote Addiction Nation, and the subtitle was a lot of discussion, is what the opioid crisis reveals about us, and focusing on that, what I believe is a fundamental reality, that there's ways that addiction is active in all of our lives. And because of the ways that it's active in all of our lives and has pervaded our culture, we all also need to be a part of the solution. And that's why it's exciting to have Drew and Carol here, because they are practitioners who understand what that looks like for a community of faith to come together and to make sure that the culture of that faith community is one that can encourage recovery, but also be one that is focused on prevention and early intervention. And there are so many ways that this matters. And I just want to share a couple of reasons why I think this is so important for churches to do. If you joined us before, you've heard a little bit about my story, but for me, I became addicted to opioids after an extended hospital stay and time in the ICU. And when I was working on telling my own story, my publisher actually came back to me and said, hey, you keep talking about this one moment with your doctor, who wasn't your therapist, wasn't a counselor, wasn't an addiction specialist. He was a pancreatic specialist. Do you have any other stories or interactions that you can draw out that were really meaningful to you? And it was a challenge for me because in my head was emblazoned this one 15-minute conversation with a pancreatic specialist that I saw as a turning point in my own journey. And even as I was writing, I was having a hard time processing why this was. And then I got to sit down with Dr. William Miller, one of the world's leading experts in addiction. He is the father of an evidence-based methodology for addressing addiction called motivational interviewing. And as I was asking him questions for my book, I was also sharing some of my own story to try to better understand what had gone on in my own life. And when I told him about this conversation, he just smiled and he goes, I've got a whole peer-reviewed academic journal article for you to read that's going to put this all in context. And so to save you from having to read the entire peer-reviewed academic journal, I just want to summarize a few points. So early in Miller's research, he really wanted to prove the effectiveness of extended counseling in treating addiction. The only problem is every time he ran a study comparing 5 hours of counseling versus 25 hours of counseling, or someone who had one session with a counselor in a self-help book versus someone who had 15 hours in counseling, he didn't see the differences he had expected. And in fact, some of the outcomes were very similar. So he started looking back into the research and into other addiction specialists who had looked at the numbers. And he found one study that just recorded the difference in tone in a doctor's voice when talking to a person about their alcohol use, and found dramatic differences just in the tone of voice. There was another study where they had people trained to go in, and when someone was admitted to the ER, they would have a 15-minute session with a trained counselor about the role of alcohol in their life. And anyone with just that 15-minute intervention was 10 times more likely to seek help after that hospitalization than someone without that 15-minute intervention. And so when he was looking through all of this research, he started to ask some key questions. He said, what's interpersonal and is potent in relatively small doses? And it seems that the more severe the problem, the greater the effect exposure to this thing might be. And he said, in looking at all of the different factors, I have come down to this might be what doctors in the medical profession call beneficence, what's in the Jewish tradition called hesed, in the Buddhist tradition metta, in Islam ramah, and in Christianity agape, that it might be the love that someone experiences at that key point, and not to diminish at all the role of professionals, the role of counseling, the role of treatment, but to say that in a lot of people's lives, in their story of recovery, there's a moment or moments they can look back to that were not necessarily driven by professional expertise, but by the empathy and love they experience from another person that they could trust. At the same time, he looked at another big study comparing different evidence-based methodologies for addressing treatment. And they wanted to see which was the best. So huge multi-site study conducted across multiple states with different researchers all crunching the data. And at the end, the big surprise was there was no statistically significant difference between these different evidence-based methodologies, but there was huge difference inside each one. And the thing that drove the difference was the empathy rating of the counselors. And so the professional piece is absolutely necessary. We aren't today asking lay leaders or clergy to all become addiction experts or counselors. In fact, it's important to understand your own limitations and the places where you need to help funnel people to, where they can get that kind of professional help. but it is to emphasize that just because you're not a professional doesn't mean that you can't be that person who expresses love and empathy and understanding when someone needs it. And the ability for a church leader, whether that person's a lay leader who's starting a book study group or a pastor who's preaching from the pulpit, to reduce the stigma, the shame, and the silence that can keep people in destructive patterns is huge. And that's why I'm excited today to hear from a couple of people who have deep experience in working in congregations. And this is not about one solution or one thing that you need to do. This is about a process that Drew and others have developed to help your congregation understand the resources that you already have and the ways to apply those to help others. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Drew. Drew, you can go. There you go.
Yep, I needed to unmute myself. Here we are in the world of Zoom and unmuting ourselves. Anyway, it is my great pleasure. I feel blessed to be a part of this webinar today. I'm so glad that I have a couple hours with you. Just kidding. Just seeing if you're listening. I'll have about 20 minutes with you and then hand it off to Carol, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers from that point on. So looking forward to that. I do have a PowerPoint presentation, how to start and sustain an addiction ministry. And if you would, based on what Tim was saying, just depending on where you are with this type of ministry, some of you are probably already doing it, others are thinking about it, but this is my invitation to an authentic ministry of compassion, love, and empathy. So I'm going to speak to kind of how you get it started, how do you sustain it, and an addiction ministry. So moving on, Tim. These are the things that we kind of said in our little blurb to you to get you involved. One is to share some stories of success and lessons learned, to talk about this tried and true process that was really started in the late 80s. And then Faith Partners became incorporated and became a nonprofit in 1995. I came on board in 1999. Just a little bit about myself. Pastor Ed had already mentioned some things, but one of the reasons why I feel called to this ministry is it has integrated my life. It has taken my personal life of faith ever since I was baptized as an infant through till now, and then it integrated it with my recovery life. I'm in long-term recovery, got into recovery in 1980, and it integrated it with my professional life, which started in 1983, going through counselor training at Hazelden, working in treatment, then working in prevention for a number of years in Hazelden, then working in public health, working with community mobilizing and coalition building and all the things that happen with prevention and public health. So the last thing that I'll talk about is the understanding of how faith communities can be an effective role, and that I was introduced to that when I was doing community mobilizing. I was working with all sectors of the community, and I had obviously a background in the faith community, and I knew this was an untapped or underutilized resource in the community because it was a natural setting for prevention with protective factors, talking about caring relationships, talking about meaningful involvement, talking about high expectations or moral development. Those are just part of the fabric of any faith community. And then also looking at recovery and healing and transformation as part of a faith community, and to be more intentional about both of those things, and then to be connected with what the efforts are in the greater community around community prevention, and also looking at recovery oriented systems of care and how to connect with those as a congregation. So moving on. One of the things that I'm experiencing, and I can imagine you're experiencing, those of you in recovery, is when in active addiction, oftentimes we feel totally isolated and alone. And here we are in a pandemic, and depending on how you've quarantined yourself, many addicts have started to experience, and I sponsor a number of people, kind of a malaise or a low-grade depression, the anxiety of the economy, all those things that are just part of what we're experiencing right now. And then also kind of a loss of trust and faith, because we've had kind of a breakdown of the economy and riots and protests, and it really has brought up a lot of what has been going on under the surface for many, many, many years. So anyway, it has tipped us, some people, into their addictions or into obsessive compulsive behavior. So that trauma can move us in that direction. So anyway, if you're wondering, is now the time? Now is the time. If you would switch Tim, move it on. One of the things, why don't we all do this? One of the things that I realized, and Tim had mentioned the idea of stigma and shame, that's often accompanies any addiction. People didn't aspire to become an addict and often do things that they're not necessarily proud of while in active addiction. Well, so what we end up having sometimes is we have one piece of that is denial. And I'm familiar with a number of phases of denial, but three of them that I think are most significant. One of them is ignorance. Just people not knowing about addiction and what's the process or the progression of the illness and what's the process of recovery, and not really being aware of what those things are until it touches our lives. So what is the solution to that? Is education. And what these teams, and I'm going to be talking about a team approach, what these teams do is create an educational platform within a congregation. And oftentimes we walk in the door of looking at alcohol and other drugs, and then look at other addictions, process addiction, behavioral addictions, such as internet pornography, gambling, shopping, workaholism, all the different things that keep us away and have harmful consequences in our life, keep us away from relationships in our life. The next one is fear. You know, if we start talking about this, then maybe people like this will come to our congregations. Well, most of us know, who are on the webinar, that they're sitting right next to you in the pew or across from you or wherever. People are touched by addiction. We do a survey of congregations that we work with. 1 in 3 has a family member. 1 in 3 in every congregation has a family member with an alcohol problem. So that's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, you. So 17% drugs, 17% eating disorders, gambling, all those things. So fearful of that. And what's the solution to that? Oftentimes we just don't know how to help a person. When they come back from treatment, how do we approach them? They've had a life-changing experience. They want to talk. So part of it is getting past that and to develop some skills to be able to step into a person's life. Then the third one is probably the most devastating, is pride. You know, maybe us Lutherans, but not, you know, maybe those Baptists, but not us Lutherans, or maybe those, you know, that community, but not our community, or pride within the family. I will take care of this. I will make this, you know, I will do what I need to do. I'm not going to ask for help. And the best way to combat that, or a solution to that, is to create a safe place. And that really speaks to the underlying goals of this ministry. The first one is to create a safe place. The second is to have the conversation. And that can be about whatever it is that is creating a need within the congregation and the congregational community. And the third is to meet people where they're at. Meet them where they're at in their experience and in their understanding. Tim, yes, if you would move on. So we're going to look at the path to readiness. And readiness, one of the things that I would talk about is we have a dance. And the dance is resistance and receptiveness. And Some of us as individuals are resistant to certain things and receptive to others. And that's true within individuals, within families, within congregations, within communities. And part of it is not to judge our resistance, but to be curious about our resistance. To start, why am I pushing back on this? And that is part of that readiness piece. And if you look at the definition, it is being adequately prepared. And I used to work in counselor training at Hazelden. One of the things we would talk about is you need knowledge, you need skills, but probably the most important thing is your attitude. And your attitudes towards the addict, your attitude towards addiction, your attitude towards ministry, all of those things. So being adequately prepared, being supportive and committed, and needing the resources, both internally but also as a congregation. Moving on. So one of the things we do at Faith Partners is we do a pre-test and a post-test. So we have integrated faith and science and married the two worlds. And so what we do is we have a 2-page survey that the congregation would fill out. And what we have found, and here you see the 4 domains in front of you, that they're all 4 of these are statistically significant to moving a congregation to being ready to do things around prevention and recovery support, all but one. And I was confused by this at first, but the only one is a person's experience with addiction. Because here I was in recovery myself, and I'm going, I'm ready to share my story, I'm ready to do the work and serve others. But it wasn't statistically significant, because part of it, and this is just a theory, and we need more research on this, is sometimes people do not share that part of their life within their congregation. Just a quick example, was working in Madison, Wisconsin. A woman came up to me after a training. She goes, I've been in Al-Anon for 24 years, but I can't do this ministry. And I said, why is that? She goes, because people don't know me that way. And that again speaks to that transparency, because people are fearful of being judged or condemned, and that thus we have the stigma and shame around this addiction or around this disease. I have one good friend that speaks, we need to turn this disease into a casserole disease. When people are going to the hospital for cancer or heart attack or whatever it is, what we do is we surround the family with casseroles and we feed them both spiritually and physically. Wouldn't that be wonderful if we did that when a person's son goes into treatment, or their spouse, or whatever? So anyway, their experience wasn't significant, but a person's attitudes towards addiction and recovery and prevention, their perception that this is a safe environment, and do I feel that I'm capable, or do I have a perceived self-efficacy? Am I capable of doing something? Move on then, Tim. So this is what happens. We do a pre-test and a post-test, and if you notice in the pre-test, it's about 43% somewhat and feel very ready, about 43%, less than half. Over a 12 to 18 month period of having this educational platform and starting that conversation and creating a safe place, it moves to about 63%, just over a 12 to 18 month period. That is a tipping point. That's over half the congregation going, we're ready, let's start doing this. So that first year and a half is about educating the congregation, and that becomes huge. Moving on. So here's the Faith Partners approach. Moving on. This is where it came from, or at least this was it was reinforced by this study that Joseph Califano did out of Columbia University. It's an older study, but it's a landmark study. And what he learned was in 2001, surveyed clergy across the country. About 94% of clergy said substance abuse is an important issue that they deal with. You jump down to that third bullet, 12% of clergy report having had any education in their seminary training. 94%, 12%. Huge gap. But they also experienced this in their pastoral care too. 38% said it was half or more of the family issues that they were dealing with. So part of what we do is needing to educate clergy, and part of that is to know what questions to ask. Sometimes the presenting problem isn't the real problem. they might present with a parenting issue or financial issue or relationship with the spouse, but the underlying issue can oftentimes be substance abuse or other addictions. So moving on. So one of the things that we do is that clergy education is one piece. The other piece is looking at the experts who are often sitting in the pews. There are people that are in recovery. There are preventionists. There are health educators, teachers, grandparents. There's people that want to help, that have empathy for those in distress. And those with compassion skills that would like to see something happen. So we train a team of people, average 3 to 7 people, sometimes up to 12 to 15 people within a congregation. We've worked with congregations as small as 25 people to thousands of people. And we've worked with about 1,000 congregations over the years. So moving on, we cover 3 areas, or 5 areas, I'm sorry. Prevention, early intervention, referral assistance, recovery support, and advocacy. And we'll be looking at those in just a little bit. But this is the process. This is the roadmap of where we go with this. The first is to build congregational support. You will always have that dance of resistance and receptiveness, and you'll have pockets of it. And so how do you address that? And so we have some tools and strategies to help that happen. How do you equip the leadership? Both clergy and staff and lay leadership, because this is a lay ministry that's supported by the pastor. So hopefully it takes off some of the things off the pastor's plate, but at the same time extends pastoral care. So equipping the leadership, the next is to develop the team, so to team formation and going through some action planning, figuring out what do we want to do in our own congregation. And often we do this within a community, and so we're working with a network of congregations. So how do they work together? So moving on, the key factors in determining direction of the ministry often is the missional focus of a particular congregation. One of the things we say right up front is we're not here to change your theology. You have spent a lifetime developing your theology, and each faith tradition has its own theology, its own doctrine. But what we want to do is to bump you up against what is your missional focus, and we'll be looking at that in the next slide. And then also, what are the needs of the congregation? They might start here. Opioid epidemic is huge now, but it used to be methamphetamine. Before that was crack cocaine. Before that, and always underage drinking, and the largest growing population of alcohol abuse is older adults. So there's often different needs that come. So the team needs to continue that educational process and that organic process to the whole thing. Then how receptive are they? Do we jump in the deep end, or do we gradually work and educate the congregation? And what are the talents of the team? They probably won't go in a direction if they're not don't have the capacity to do that. Moving on. Here are some missional focuses. Do we create a safe place? Is our missional focus healing in our congregation? Is it discipleship or capacity building, building disciples, helping people develop the skills and knowledge that they need to go out and help others? One congregation I worked with in southern Minnesota was a Lutheran congregation in Owatonna. The pastor would do something, and he'd bring in, every quarter, bring in somebody from a community resource, and he would do some education around gambling, eating disorders, sexual addiction, and about 10 to 15 people would come. And he finally, from the pulpit, he goes, "I don't think you get it. I'm not doing this. So if you come to this, you have self-identified yourself with that problem. That is not my intent. What I want you to do is to be equipped to help people with these maladies, with these diseases and issues." So discipleship, teaching, and there's so much teaching that needs to go on with these particular issues. Evangelism or outreach, social justice, and we're certainly speaking a lot to social justice nowadays. So moving on. The other thing that's important to our model is we aren't just a recovery support model, such as Celebrate Recovery or Overcomers or Alcoholics Victorious. There's just numerous different recovery support models. We think recovery support is foundational to it, but that's only for about 30% of the population. About 8 to 12%, when we look at alcohol, 8 to 12% are diagnosably alcoholic. About 22 to 24% abuse alcohol. So about 70%, so if you look at this thing, the line that between misuse and problem use, 70% needs education. It might be a grandparent raising a grandchild. They need education about what are the new drugs and what are the signs and symptoms, and how can they recognize if their grandchild is dabbling or experimenting. So there's part of our model is looking at that there's ministry points along the whole continuum. And sometimes what we tend to do is we just do recovery support, so it's Alcoholics Anonymous in the basement, so it becomes a stepchild of the congregation. We want it to be part of the fabric of the congregation because we are all touched by these issues. Moving on. So here are some of those things. Prevention, critical. When is important to do prevention? People will often say time of youth, or pre-decision making. Yes, that's critical. But what I would say is it's during times of transition. And where better, and we look at prevention across the lifespan, where better to do it than in a congregation which is intergenerational. So when you're looking at transition, you're looking at elementary school to middle school to high school to college or their first job. As an adult, your first job, marriage, maybe divorce, death of a spouse, retirement. All these times of transitions are when people are most vulnerable, but also need a prevention message of some information and support and skills. So perfect opportunity to be able to enter into that. Retirement is a huge piece. 2008, 2009, unemployment. Now we're in unemployment now, time of transition. So part of it is giving support around these areas. Early intervention. 94%, according to a Gallup poll, 94% knows somebody in their life that they're concerned about. 34% actually act on their concern. 60% difference. My guess is the only reason people don't step into people's life is because they feel they don't know how to. So part of that is that skill building. Referral assistance. How do you make those helpful, warm handoffs? So how do you make those helpful, warm handouts? I'm just getting a 5-minute warning here. So to be connected to the community resources, and as for a pastor to be up with the community resources, that's near impossible, but to have a team of people that do that on a regular basis and start to create a relationship with these resources, who then can do some of the educational pieces as the ministry grows and evolves. You start to develop this reciprocal relationship where maybe a treatment center sends them to your church for worship services or Bible studies, and you, when you have people that are in need, have these resources within the community. Recovery support, a huge piece of that, and there's many models. Dr. Dale Ryan has come up with 8 of them, from AA in the basement to what we would call, which is our model, is advocacy model, which we're looking at advocacy along the whole continuum. Giving a person a voice, where oftentimes the people feel like they don't have a voice. They might be a family member sitting there with their life feels like it's unraveling around them, and they're not sure who to go to. And maybe their pride keeps them from asking for help. So it's somebody sharing their own story and giving that person permission to speak to their story. Moving on. As you can probably experience, I am just doing highlights and I'm unable to do deep dives, but one of the deep dives, one of the things I'd like to speak to is, when we think of advocacy, we often think of legislative advocacy, but that's only one level of advocacy. The first one is speaking in favor of yourself or others. It's telling your story. I remember in the congregation I worked with, attended United Lutheran in Red Wing, Minnesota. We said, we need to have somebody tell their story. And we go, one of the people in the group said, well, we should have this person. He's he'll get everyone laughing. So what we end up thinking about is, well, let's get a professional AAer to come in and tell their story. But what ends up happening is people say, yeah, there's a problem, but it's out there. So we ended up having our own person, somebody in our own team, tell their story. 60-year-old a woman, was an author. She asked her husband, can I tell my story because it affects you? He said yes. The night before, she got cold feet. So she called her AA sponsor, and her sponsor goes, just imagine you're speaking to one other woman who needs to hear what you have to say. So she did 3 services. The next day, on Monday night, her regular AA meeting, a younger woman makes eye contact with her, walks across the smoky basement, and she said, I saw you on Sunday morning, and I knew I needed to be here. It's that self-advocacy that leads to case advocacy and helping others navigate the system. Public advocacy, looking at education, educating people on what is happening out there. Organizational, developing guidelines. Quick example of that, Tulsa, Oklahoma Methodist Church. They've been doing this for 8 years, this ministry for 8 years. A self-identified sex offender knocked on their door saying, I want to worship here. And they're going, oh my gosh, what do we do with this? And they said, well, let's develop some policies and procedures. And they developed that. It took them about 2 or 3 months to do, and they welcomed him in. Well, he came in, he worshiped with them for about 3-4 years, and then a job took him away from that. And what ended up happening with that, and you could call this organic because it's an evolving ministry, or you can call it being led by the Spirit, is there was a group of people that had been sexually abused as a child, and they were now adults. So they end up hiring someone from the community to develop a support group for adult survivors of child abuse or sexual abuse. And that evolved from this ministry. Not everyone's going to do that, but they were brave enough to walk down that road. So organizationally, they had some guidelines, and then legislative. So moving on. We talked a little bit about the advocate. Really what we're trying to change, we're trying to create some cultural change. We're looking at changing an individual, changing the congregation, and then creating a safe place so individuals and families can transform and do the healing that they need to do within their own congregations. So moving on, we're getting close to the end here. What is this transformational ministry? What are the benefits? It helps members address addiction. It extends pastoral care. It often fits with our missional focus. It shares ministry with clergy, with lay people. It also helps pastors' health. I can't imagine, I have a good friend who started his clergy ministry in the 50s, and he goes, that was the healthiest profession back then. Now it's one of the most unhealthy professions because pastors their expectation is that they are available 24/7, and that's just not realistic. So how do we disciple others to be able to do some of the work that we want to see done? Moving on. Last couple of things. So here are some strategies for sustainability. We basically have three phases: readiness, developmental phase, and then sustainability. And you can see some of them here, and personal investment, to have a planning process, which is that second bullet. The third is to connect with community efforts. The fourth is to have some area coordination, not just if we train 10 congregations, have them be individual congregations never connecting, but meeting quarterly and doing program sharing and networking and some collaborative efforts and ongoing education. Again, develop a capacity of advocacy. Move it to a denominational effort. I'm working with a group in the greater Milwaukee Synod who has developed a resolution to develop a task force who is now doing this because they have permission to do it, and then to look at a national movement. So moving on, last slide. I want to end with this biblical reference, and most of you know this reference. I'm going to skip down towards the end, but I didn't know where to stop. It's basically we as a church, the body of the church, and this is God, but God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. So wouldn't it be wonderful if we could unpack our stories? And for some of us, it's addiction. For others, it's other things. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Carol, and she'll really speak to this on a congregational and a community level.
Thank you, Drew. That was really excellent and heartfelt. Hello, everyone, and thank you for participating today. My name is Carol Pine. I am a person in long-term recovery, and I have been blessed to work with Drew for a long time now. The disease of addiction is alive and well and thriving, especially during this time of COVID. One of my colleagues in our Faith Partners team that I'm going to tell you about said goodbye to his daughter of 47 years this week at a memorial service. She had been through 4 treatments. She had concluded that alcoholism had taken over her life and there was no chance for her. And she jumped off the Ford Parkway Bridge here on the Mississippi River a couple weeks ago. She left a husband and 4 children behind. And my friend Jim, who I think Drew will remember, fortunately has a black belt in Al-Anon because he has suffered many losses to this disease. About 18 years ago, my pastor at House of Hope Presbyterian Church in St. Paul, Minnesota, came to myself and a couple other folks that she knew were in recovery. And she said, I just had a heartbreaking meeting with a family in our congregation. They are scared to death about what is happening to their daughter. She is on a path with alcoholism and we don't know what to do. And we are coming to you to advise us. Our pastor came to us later and told us that story, and she said, I didn't have any training in seminary on this subject. I felt completely without resources, and all I could do was pray for them and pray with them. What can you do at House of Hope Church to change that? So with that question, a group of us started a Faith Partners ministry at House of Hope Presbyterian Church. It's a big old church with about 1,200 members. And given Drew's statistic about the number of folks, 1/3, 1 out of 3 folks are dealing with either addiction themselves or someone they love who is struggling, there was much to be done at House of Hope. We organized, we developed a mission and a vision for what we plan to do. Our members were either in recovery themselves, healthcare professionals, or loved people who were in recovery and were themselves attending 12-step meetings. We did a congregational survey to get an idea of just how interested and concerned our congregation members were about this subject of addiction. And the results told us that there were concerns, that people needed information, and that was what we wanted to know. We created educational programs after the morning service that were very well attended on everything from understanding what AA and Al-Anon is, understanding what addiction is and how it affects a person's life, looking at any number of addictions, not simply alcohol and drug addiction, but issues with food, issues with work, issues with screen time. There are many ways that we humans find to soothe ourselves. And addiction is a popular way to do it. We asked our members if they were willing to share an experience of their own with addiction, and we put it in our church newsletter. And I had said to them early on, you do not need to sign this. You do not need to go public if you don't feel comfortable. What was amazing and heartening to me was that every single person who wrote for the newsletter, and it was most of our team members, signed their names, which brings us to the most important part of this ministry, in my judgment. The members of our team were all willing to say, I struggle with the issue of addiction, or I love someone who struggles with addiction, and here is what I'm learning about it. They were willing to go public. They were willing to help organize educational programs for our entire congregation that, by the way, were very well attended. To Drew's point, fortunately, we had a large congregation, so folks who attended didn't feel as though they were being singled out or sort of declaring that they had a problem by attending our educational programs. So that was a good thing. By doing this outreach, we accomplished many things. We helped educate our congregation members. We helped our pastor learn more about the disease of addiction. We provided her with our support if she needed us to make a 12-step call with someone who was struggling. And as a congregation, as a church, we were able to create a setting that people felt safe to come to and be honest about their struggles. And we all know that addiction thrives in secrecy. And what we did was lift the veil on that secrecy at our church and make it okay to talk about addiction. And especially okay to talk about the fact that recovery does in fact happen. About 10 years ago, I decided that as much as I love my native state of Minnesota, I would just as soon spend my winters somewhere else. So I moved to Savannah, Georgia 10 years ago. I have nicknamed it the city of the Big Red Cup. It is a big drinking city, small city with a lot of drinking. And I joined a Methodist church in Savannah. And I talked to my pastor about creating some kind of educational program in Savannah. What we have done, we have not, our focus is not on one particular church. We have created an organization called the Interfaith Addiction and Recovery Coalition. Our goal and purpose is to educate faith leaders of all faiths about addiction and recovery so that they are in a better position to be of support to their congregation members who are struggling, so that, like my pastor at House of Hope, they could do more than simply, and I don't mean to underestimate the value of prayer, but do more than pray for the person. We have a group of volunteers, about 20 of us, who are either in recovery ourselves, love people who are in recovery, or are health care providers, or mental health and addiction counselors and therapists. We have a cabinet of advisors that we put together because, after all, we are creating educational programming for faith leaders, and they're the ones who can tell us what they need to know most. That cabinet includes faith leaders from the Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Baha'i, and Quaker traditions. So we truly are interfaith. Last year, before COVID, We were able to offer 3 educational forums for our faith leaders that were very well attended in Savannah. The first one was called Underage and Under the Influence, and it was all about underage drinking and drugging. The second we called Who You Gonna Call? And we focused on all the resources that are available in the community of Savannah, as well as the state of Georgia, that faith leaders need to know about, because we don't expect them to become therapists, but we hope that they will be knowledgeable about what the resources are so they can be supportive and refer their congregation members who are struggling to the kind of resources that we have available. And the third one was the most powerful, I have to say. We had a panel of 4 of our faith leader cabinet members who spoke personally and honestly and openly about their own experience with addiction. One is in recovery himself. Another is a family member of a recovering person. Another was a drug addict as a younger man, and now he is an imam at in Savannah. And the fourth is an adult child of an alcoholic. And they all lifted the veil on the subject of addiction by talking openly about their own experience. This year, we're not so lucky to have those forums, unfortunately. So we are offering a virtual family program in collaboration with Hazelden and Betty Ford, which we are very excited about. And in lieu of a forum, another forum, we have created an e-newsletter for our faith leaders. And our second one goes out in a couple days. So I think I'm probably reached my limit on time, and I'll just say that if you are a faith leader, please have the courage to go ahead and create a Faith Partners program in your church or mosque or temple. I have learned that unless you have faith leader support for this kind of effort, it will not happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol, and thank you, Drew, and thanks to all of you who have been dropping in some comments and questions. A couple questions that I can tick off right away. Drew, I believe you're all right with making your presentation available to folks afterwards. And, oh, you're muted. And also we'll be sending out an email in the next couple of days with a recording, and can include some of those references to some of the studies that we've cited, as well as additional information. And Drew is also going to be hosting and with Ed a more in-depth training on what he covered today. And so we've got a handful of questions that have already come in. And just given time, I'm going to try to condense a few of them together. Got a question from Joy about how a ministry centered in substance and process use disorder treatment can engage with those re-entering from re-incarceration. And then have another question that focuses in on the dangers of those either without experience themselves as being in recovery, ending up being codependent, getting into some codependent issues while serving in a ministry. And then also, if you have any insight about a church following a specific organization's guidelines like AA or Al-Anon as kind of a back-end source for a Christian ministry. So Drew, if you want to bite off a few of those pieces, that would be great.
I will be happy to. Going to the first one, with reentry programs for those in incarceration, oftentimes, like most of these ministries, and I had mentioned, is it a missional focus? Is it a need in the congregation? Is the congregation receptive? Is there capacity on the team? That will define it. Oftentimes, these are peer-to-peer types of efforts. So it might be a person that has experienced jail or prison that says, I want to do a prison ministry and I want it to be part of what we're doing here. And so it often comes from within the congregation to actually then become open and kind of that light on top of the hill to make that happen. So that's one thing I would say to that. The second question, and I'm trying to remember what the second question is. I'm getting older here. I should have wrote it down. What was the second question again, Tim?
So that was on the dangers of people having unhealthy relationships with those
Yes,
they're trying to
yes.
help and serve.
Perfect. You need to be doing that at the front end, throughout, and at the back end as well. I have often worked with congregations that have Stephen's ministry programs and taught and got into, because they don't talk about alcohol and drugs, got into the idea of having boundaries, enabling, what does it look like? Because what tends to happen is we mistake it for Christian love. And so to understand not doing for someone what they can do for themselves as kind of a rule of thumb, and being able to understand that and to be able to get into the nuance of that dynamic is critical and needs training. We also, at the very front end, we have kind of a pre-screening tool, because some people will want to become part of this team ministry that actually need help themselves. So to be able to have a pre-screening tool so people can recognize, maybe this is not for you right now, but maybe you need to focus in on your own recovery, be it as a family member of a loved one who's an addict, or with their own addictive behavior. Maybe you need to be in your own recovery, but a year, 2, 3 years down the road, we would love you to be a part of this ministry because you'll have something to offer. And then of course there's one of the things I did was, as an area coordinator, and I worked with about 35, 40 congregations in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, and I would get calls from team facilitators going, we have somebody that we're concerned about, how do we address this? And we would talk with the pastor and work through that. So it does happen, but if you can get it at the front end and work with the team about those issues, boundary issues and enabling. One of the best books I've seen is by Townsend and Cloud, Boundaries. It's an incredible book around boundaries. That should be a study guide for teams. So anyway, I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you, Drew. And I've got another question about specifics with faith partners, but Ed, I know you're covering that in some of your closing announcements, and we are almost at the top of the hour. So Ed, would you like to close us out and give some information about ways people can take next steps with faith partners?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tim. And thank you to all our guests, Carol, Drew, and Tim. This is our second webinar, and I've just really been amazed at the quality of people we're getting on these webinars. So thank you. You guys have just done a fantastic job. I'm very proud to be a part of this. We have everything that Drew talked about here is going to be offered in a training, and it's beginning next Wednesday night and the following Wednesday night after, the 29th and the August 5th. And it is the training that Drew does with congregations, but he's doing it online because of the pandemic. We have about 7 congregations participating now, and we have room for more. And the idea is to bring your pastor and a lay leader or 2 or 3 who will be the leaders of this ministry. The pastor is not going to lead it, but he needs to support it and understand it. So bring a small team of leaders who are going to run with it. They'll come to this training. It's Wednesday night and the following Wednesday night. And then over the next year, Drew will work with that group. They'll come back in the fall, late fall, to do a team training. So between this training and the team training, that team will go back to their parishes. They'll do the congregational survey. They'll recruit a team to be a part of this, and they'll build it up and get it ready. And they'll bring that team back in the fall for more training. The workshop and the lessons on the next 2 Wednesdays are $125 per congregation, regardless of how many you bring, and it includes all the materials. But if you want to do the complete training, it's another $400. I think the total is $575. So do the math. Subtract the 125 from that. It must be $450 then. Is that right? I don't do math well. Anyway, so if you want to do the whole training, it's going to be more. I'm hoping to secure some funds for those who can't afford that, and we'll be able to provide some scholarships. So I can't guarantee that yet, but we're working on it. And so please consider that. That's probably the most effective of all. People come to me because I'm doing this ministry now and say, well, what do we do? And I say, go see Drew. He is going to help you make all this happen. He's quite good at what he does. And you heard that today. And so you can, if you're interested in that, go to faith-partners.org and let Drew know you're coming, and he will get you all set up. That's the Addiction Ministry Leadership Training next Wednesday night, and then the following Wednesday night. And then we have our Addiction and Faith Conference coming up next February. We're waiting to see if we can actually gather by then. We're hoping to, and if not, we'll figure out how to move it online. But we have some stellar keynote speakers. Tim is one of those. You got a little taste of him today, and he's got a lot more to share. He'll be a keynote speaker along with Sonia Waters, a professor from the Episcopalian Church who teaches on pastoral care and addiction, also an excellent speaker, and so many other workshops and tools and equipment for congregations to take back to their parish. We've done 2 of these, and everybody goes back saying that was incredible, and people are inspired and see the need for this. We're also developing a new ministry, and I'm going to be launching the new website in a month, and it will contain all the resources we're talking about, and we'll begin to develop more for the future, including these webinars, and we'll be adding some podcasts, and there'll be some materials from our previous conferences on that site. Lots of great material for your church to find resources to do this ministry. And so we're just growing that. That's just being born. As I said, I'll launch the website next month, I hope. But we need your help. It is a baby and it needs nurture. And so if you can volunteer, there are ways that you want to help. And if there's a ways that you can give and help provide the funding, it certainly needs that as well. You can contact me at pastored@addictionandfaith.com. Let me know how you can help and contribute to this really amazing ministry that I'm so excited about. There's so many great people doing such great work, and I want to try and bring them all to you. I think that's all I have here. I just wanted to point out that Carol was on a houseboat. That's why she was moving, I believe. You noticed her screen moving a little bit. But thank you, Carol. That was exactly what we needed to hear, was how this works in a parish and a congregation. And again, my thanks to Tim and Drew. And one more thing before I let you go. We're working on, we don't have a date yet, but we're working on a 5-part series webinar on addiction and race. We want to unpack how drug policy, addiction, and drugs have been used in our society to cause racial injustice and oppression. And we're going to talk about where we're at now with how that works with our drug policies in this country. And we're going to talk to some people about the history of how we got here and where do we go from here. It's an important topic, and the more we know about it, the more we can address it faithfully. That's all I got. I thank you again for being here. Thank you for those who participated here today. And I hope you'll come to our next webinar. God bless you. Go in peace. Serve the Lord.